All right, hey guys, welcome to Friday night Bible study through the letter to the Romans, one of the greatest letters penned. And we have been going verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and then um, through this book, kind of unpacking it. So we're not rushing through it. And I think there's a lot that we can glean from it. So let me just jump right into it. Um, as I often say, Romans is when we talk about the epistles. First of all, and I know I say this all the time, how um, whichever book I'm reading, that book I'm going to say it's amazing because all Scripture is amazing. So when I say that the letter of the Romans is amazing, is because the context, what Paul is dealing with, what we're going to deal with. And I'm going to say the same thing when we get to Thessalonians, when I get to Philippians, So we're studying Ephesians, on our Tuesday nights. Again, same thing. I'm going to say that it is, they're going to be wonderful. They're wonderful books. All right. Now, down at verse number 16. I'll read through this just to kind of catch up. And this is what Paul says: "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, also to the Greek. For in it God's righteousness is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." This becomes extremely important, as we will see later on, as far as the when we get into a deep dive on the topic of salvation. And so this statement, "For in it God's righteousness is revealed from faith to faith," then he says, "as it's written, the righteous will live by faith." And then he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth, since what can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, has been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse, for though they though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became nonsense, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Therefore, God delivered them over in the cravings of their hearts to sexual impurity, so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. This is where we left off. And I spent a little time talking about the cravings of the heart, their cravings, the sinful cravings. And I think this is important to understand, because in our society today, there are people that there are people. I'm trying to think, because I don't want to. I'm trying to see how to word this. But part of the Christian world, through politics, they have targeted certain sinful behaviors, but it's for political reasons and not for biblical reasons. Although they come in the name of the Lord, they come and they put at the front, Christianity. Now, I don't want to get too deep into this, and that's why I'm kind of struggling to find. I'm going to find the right words, because that I'm not going to um, 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 this political game, and it was a game. It was a game that, well, no. I'll reclassify it. It wasn't a game. It was a carefully crafted political maneuver. When we talk about the Christian conservative movement today, if you go back, it was in the 60s. It was called the Christian right. And the response was to the counterculture, which kind of began in the 50s. So if you go back, and I know I want you to understand the kind of the mentality. That's why I'm going through this. So when you kind of go back in before the 50s, like the 30s and the 40s, they were always, some people say that they were the golden age of America. And that's okay if you were white, obviously. But then you had this kind of image, and it was a fake image, but you had this image of what the American dream was, what the American family, husband, wife, 2 kids, house, white picket fence, go to church on Sundays. That's kind of the image. That's the image they portrayed. It's fake because, again, you had sinful behavior, you had adultery, you had alcohol abuse, and you had abuse because of alcohol. But they hid that. If a teenager got pregnant, she went off for the summer to visit Aunt May or somebody, and then came back. They hid it. They just hid the sin. Well, then what you see that the seeds of the culture change happened in around the 50s. For example, with people like Elvis Presley, when he was swinging his hips, they thought that was, oh my God, they thought the world was coming to an end. So then when you kind of go into the 60s, what was called the counterculture, that's when the religious right stood up. So you had the counterculture, the hippie movement. Okay, so you had college kids, you had white teenagers, white young adults that was rebelling against the establishment. And the way they did that was they let their hair grow. They were unkempt, beards and stuff. They walk around with no shirts, jeans with holes in them. Okay, the hippie, free love, drugs. So you saw that. And so one of the response was with the Christian right to counteract that, okay? And they came up with, especially when and then this eventually happened that a lot of the people you despise grew up and then became principals, administrators, lawmakers, things like that. But one of the ways that the Christian right responded was they had they came up with a a platform, a political platform that they would address. Some of the things on it was abortion, the gay rights, prayer in school, things like that. Well, obviously now that um, um, the um, they've outgrown the prayer. The prayer in the school is not so much of a big deal. One of the big kind of push now is to put the 10 Commandments back into the school, which is, again, it's silly. From a Christian perspective, what will that prove, having the 10 Commandments? what did it prove when they were there? Even if you said, we're going to say a prayer every day, again, that it becomes unconstitutional. Again, I'm resisting getting too deep in that because it's just not the heart of the subject here. My point is that the Christian right, they were about a political agenda, not a Christian agenda. And in doing so, they targeted, which eventually, because again, they lost the battle on certain other fronts, like prayer in school. Okay, they lost that battle. So they kept pounding on the abortion and then on the gay rights, which they still do. And this is my point, because you make that the boogeyman instead of, well, what does God think about that? And then on top of that, you produce hypocrites, because a lot of people are still closeted. And my point is that then how do they deal with? So, for example, you got people who are they're closeted. They're closeted. You can say gay, right? They're closeted. Um, well, a lot of stuff, because the Christian world makes it, if you came out and said, I'm struggling with these things, you would be ostracized. Right? Think about, if you all can remember Pastor Ted Haggard, look what happened to him, right? But of course, here was a different story. He was exposed, but he was exposed because he knew that in his struggles with his homosexuality, he couldn't come out. He couldn't express that. And that's a whole other thing too. I know I'm not necessarily being fair to either side with the arguments, because there's legitimate reasons, that if you look at, but I mean, the point is that, the church now has become hypocritical because they target that sin. But it's a sin, as we're going to study here. And even now you see some of the apologetics debate, they're going to use this passage of scripture to say, well, God condemns the gays, right? God condemns the gays. We're going to see this later on here in this very passage. But that's not all he condemns. And Paul is pointing out, and again, let's kind of go back even to the time that he's writing. Remember, this is the Roman world that he's writing this to. So Paul wasn't just condemning and isolating homosexuality. And as a Christian, our perspective also should be that as Jesus saved us, so can he save them. Okay, enough of that, because again, I'm going too far into that and I didn't mean to. So when he says, therefore, that God delivered them over to the craving of the heart, the reason why I wanted to say that, kind of remind us, we did talk about this, is that because of our sinful nature, everyone have inclinations to some sin, some lust, you could say some homosexuality, some adultery, fornication. So which sin is worse, homosexuality or adultery? See, from God's perspective, they're going to be the same. Some have inclinations for alcoholism, drugs, pride, greed, okay? Covetousness, which Paul says is idolatry. So, these are part of the sinful nature, and that's the whole point. They're part of the sinful nature. Therefore, God delivered them over to the cravings of their hearts, to sexual impurity, so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. So this was a reality during the Roman time. This is why Paul is addressing this. This was common in the Roman world. It wasn't political. It wasn't social. It was just common. Now, Christians who were coming to faith, now Paul is what? Saying you have to change your behaviors. You cannot act the way that you once did. He says they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worship and serve something created instead of the Creator, who is praised forever. So now let's kind of go back, because he says to sexual impurity. The word sexual impurity, the word sexual impurity, let me see if the New King James says something different. I may have to go to the original King James. And let's see, verse 24. So I'm going to read to you from the New King James. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. And then it says to exchange the truth of God for a lie and worship and serve the creature. Okay, so he says when he says the cravings of the heart, he says the lust of the hearts, and then he says to dishonor their bodies among themselves. All right, let's look at the King James. I'm only reading that because a lot of people are used to the King James. I am used to the King James, even though I have the Holman Christian Standard Bible translation is my reading Bible, and that's what I'm reading from here. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies. So the King James, when it is dishonor their own bodies, whereas the Holman Christian Standard here says sexual impurity. Another word that is commonly used here is fornication. And I said this, that the word fornication, I hear it talks about to dishonor their own bodies. And he's going to also go to later, which I'm not going to get into, but the let's see. All right. So anyway, he said they exchanged. No, he says God delivered them over in the cravings of their hearts to sexual impurity, or as the King James said, dishonor their bodies. And then he said so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. So that's the phrase here. That when let me read this again in the New King. I'm sorry. It said, therefore God gave them up to uncleanness. So then the word uncleanness is used here instead of sexual impurity. Then it says that their bodies were degraded, and it says here, it said their hearts were dishonored. Okay. So the word uncleanness is also used for the word fornication. It's also here as it used for sexual impurity. Let me just say this too. A lot of times I know people make a big issue out of translations. The one that I'm reading from, the Holman Christian Standard, is a very, very modern translation. I want to say that it was translated within the last 25 years. I want to say 25 to 30 years. And they use a lot of, so that they use a lot of modern language structure as well as words. So some people take objections to the use of the word sexual impurity, but then I would ask, how can any sexual impurity be right? And my point is, I think people just make issues out of stuff that, in my opinion, is not a big deal. It's still bad. So the sexual impurity, and then the word uncleanness, you see in the King James that uncleanness is used, and also sometimes uncleanness and fornication is used, sometimes interchangeable, but sometimes together, uncleanness, and um, then the fornication. Now the word fornication, and that's just what would apply here, sexual impurity, is any sexual activity outside of the God ordained marriage. Any sexual activity outside of the God ordained marriage. Now, in the King James, you will also see that fornication is used, and then you can also see that fornication is used, and then also adultery separate. No, my throat is kind of all of a sudden dry. But fornication is used, and then adultery. But fornication could be all encompassing. It can include adultery, which again, all sexual activity outside of the God ordained marriage. In other words, here's the thing: God created sex to be enjoyed within what we call holy matrimony or the God ordained marriage. So Christians, okay, because I'm not talking to the world, but Christians, if you want to get married, if you want to have sex, God says get married. That's basically it. And that's augmented in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Again, if you want to get married, if you want to have sex, get married. God created you a sexual being within the confines of marriage. So in anything outside of that is sexual impurity or fornication, okay, or uncleanness, okay. So the conversations now that as we're going need to have within the church. If you go outside to the church, and this is where the mistake of a lot of Christians are, you're trying to reform sinners that are given over to the cravings of their heart. And that's why we talked about, until you get born again, you will be a slave to sin. And this is why you have people who have their particular struggles, because they are slave to their sins. This is why Christians wrestle with their old nature. The difference between a Christian and a sinner that's alive, their flesh still wants to sin. That's the craving. See, it's still there. And if you stop and you think about this, it's still there because, let me kind of go back because it's worth going over. We've covered this, I know. It's worth going over. All right, if you remember, we covered this: the spirit, soul, and the body. Okay, that man is the spirit, he has a soul, and he lives in the body. Okay, the soul is the immaterial part of man. Your spirit is the real you, and then of course your body. Now, it's broken down like this: your spirit and your soul is the inseparable part. In other words, when you die, your spirit and your soul are separated from your body. And that's why I remember we read, for example, on the Mount of Transfiguration, Elijah and Moses appeared to Jesus. And Elijah had been dead 800 years. Moses had been dead 1,500 years. So what were we looking at? Well, their spirit. Now, their soul, their spirit is what makes them aware of God, but it is also the life source of the body. So James tells us, like it's a body without the spirit is dead. It really constitutes death. Now, there is a medical standard to use. But then if the spirit leaves, we could say from the spiritual standpoint, then your spirit and your soul leaves your body. Your soul has your mind, will, emotions, and desires, right? Desires. And when Adam sinned, he was cut off from God. He was alienated from God. So now we live by our bodies. And even though we are born again, we still are cut off. In other words, we don't sense our spirit is alive, but we're not in tune to God through our spirits. I know people say they are. People say a lot of things. People say a lot of things. So the idea is that, but now, before you come to Christ, that spirit is dead, alienated from God, separated from God. So now we get our information through our bodies, this physical unit, right? Our bodies, which has sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. Through those senses, we contact the physical world around us. That's just one problem. The physical world around us is controlled by Satan, and the whole world is under the sway of the wicked one. So if we just use today's example, and by the way, this also was going on in Rome. You know, Rome didn't have social media, but you could pretty much almost walk anywhere and you could see perversion going on. You could see all kinds of sin going on. So now think about this. When you see that, it incites you. Why? Because what you receive from sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell comes through your body. Now, your body, and this is the point I think it's important to understand. Your body is a mechanism that simply wants to be gratified. That's it. It wants to be gratified. Just gratify me. I want to be gratified. So let's say on we can keep it holy. I'm being humorous here. But my body, I just want to eat Hostess ding dongs. I can just shove them in my mouth one after the other. Hostess apple pies. My daughter made me some apple pies the other day, and they were spectacular. And she made me kind of a case of them, and I literally wanted to eat them all in one night. Now, why did I want to do that? Because they were just that good. And despite the health risk, I'm older now. I certainly am trying to avoid certain health issues. And one of the ways to do that is a better diet. My flesh don't care about that. I wanted to stuff those pies one after the other because my body wants gratification. Now, the same thing could be for alcohol, right? I'm not an I don't drink alcohol. I never did. When I was younger, I never acquired the taste, but a lot of people do. I can't understand how people can drink alcohol. I don't understand how you can drink vodka, whiskey. I don't, And to me, wine ain't that sweet. But again, I know that's just me though. I never acquired the taste. But see, people's body crave it. They crave it. People crave drugs. They crave drugs. Why? Their body craves drugs. So while I don't do drugs either, I never did it. So why I never did drugs or drunk alcohol, I can tear up some food because my body craves it. My body doesn't crave drugs. I'm sure I can get to a point where it's doing that. But my body doesn't crave drugs. My body doesn't crave alcohol. But it craves that sugar. Now you get to other stuff. Why do we lust? Because my body craves passion, sex. It loves to be touched. It loves to touch. It craves that. Right? Why do you have, and again, this was something that was common when Paul wrote this. Orgies were common in the Roman world. Why? Because people want more. They want more and more of the craving. Just like with drugs, you want you want a greater fix. You want a stronger alcohol, right? Although for me, I ding dongs could do it for me. If all I had to eat was ding dongs, I think my body would say, "Okay, just keep shoving them in." Okay, but I don't know. But anyway, so why do we become slaves to these things? Because my body craves my body craves gratification. So that's the simple understanding of it. Now my body hasn't changed, even though I'm born again. I'm born of God. In my spirit, God cries out, "Abba, Father." But my body is like, "That's nice, but get some ding dongs. That's nice, but let's look at the women. Look at the women, right?" And we hear, I not don't run in these circles, but you certainly can hear about the exploits of people, and they end up getting them in trouble. Why? And people can get in trouble because of their bodies, right? We um, because giving into the cravings. Why? Because their bodies constantly say, "Hey, just gratify me, gratify me." And your mind, in your soulish area, your mind, your emotions, and then your desires become, okay, they become conditioned. So when your body says gratify, your mind processes that and you want it. Now, in a later chapter, we'll deal more with this in terms of overcoming, the urges, shutting your body down, saying, recognizing, and here's the thing though, recognizing, because when people tell you, I don't have temptation, they're liars. I don't know why they would want to say that, but they do. They try to, like they're super Christians. Now don't get me wrong. I'm not drooling at the mouth for ding dong. I often tell people this, that if you hear a rumor that me and Beyonce was caught in a hotel room, I'm going to say it's true. And no, I'm lying. It'll never be true, right? But I'm using this as the illustration because, first of all, you know, it would be Beyonce. So no one would believe it, right? But here's my point. Let's say in a fantasy world, Beyonce's blowing up my phone. B, can't do it, right? Here's what I'm saying. I would never go into the hotel room. Because if I go in the hotel room with Beyonce, it's on. I'll be asking for forgiveness from my wife, from God, but it's on. What you learn to overcome is not going that direction. All right, let's end the fantasy here, because like I say, it'll just never happen, because it's, like I say, it's Beyonce. But I think you get my point. That it's not that I can't fall into adultery. I know the door. I know the road. I'm not going that way. I come home to my wife. I don't have friends, like girlfriends, like the girl who is a friend. Because, again, it's a setup. I'm setting myself up. See, I'm setting myself up. Don't go there. Not going to go there. Because my body wants sex. My body wants to grope. Now get this, my body wants to grope. But you have to overcome and say, you know what? We're not going to even stir it up. So no, I'm not walking around holding my hand back. No, we just don't. But what I'm telling you is that my body doesn't care the gratification. My body doesn't care the gratification. My body doesn't care where the gratification comes from. If I put a blindfold over, and you take my hand, I wouldn't know who's licking it. But my body would say it feels good. Lick, 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 right? It feels good, my hand. Then I take it out, it's a dog. You know how some of y'all are with your dogs. See, your body doesn't care. The body doesn't care. Now, your mind cares. Or your mind cares until it gets, you start degrading it. You start contaminating it, right? Maybe curiosity. There's a lot of sick stuff going on. Bestiality, by the way, happens a lot more than we like to acknowledge. Why? Because the sinful nature, corrupt minds, and the uncontrolled cravings of my bodies. My point is, my body won't care. That's why I have to say to my body, I have to control it. I have to control it. If I was an addict, and they do tell you this, but we're bringing the spiritual in now. But an alcoholic always has to deal with the cravings from his body to take that sip. That one sip. Just one sip. But that sip is going to lead to a relapse, won't it? Same thing with drugs. Why? Because your body. The point that I'm saying here is people need to stop playing the games, mind games, and say, well, my body doesn't even test. That's a fool that says that. That's why I said, your body always wants that. Your body always wants to sin. And the idea of the sin is that it always wants to be gratified. And it doesn't care who. If you stop and you think about it, anybody can make you feel good. Anything can make you feel good. Your body doesn't care. Right? Your body doesn't care. Women, your body doesn't care if it's a man, if it's a woman, if it's a vibrator. Your body doesn't care. So now, when we come to our growth in Christ, this is where we learn to say no to our bodies. We also should understand from the world. Now think about this. Before people that is not in Christ. And again, does it mean that everybody's running rampant? Of course they're not. But some are, and you probably could say too many people are. Too many people are. This is why we have these, think about this. There are people who love to kill. Now, right there's some mind stuff going on, right? With serial killers. One of the most infamous, of course, Jeffrey Dahmer, that he killed, he ate, and then he also had sex. I think he had sex both alive and dead, right? So there's some sick, twisted mind stuff going on there. So in the world of the sinners, okay, that's why I said now, if we're trying to reform people without them coming to Christ, getting their natures changed, their spiritual natures changed, then how can you try to get them to stop doing something that their nature haven't changed? And which Christians still wrestle with themselves. As I said, if you're an alcoholic, why is it that you're an alcoholic for the rest of your life? Because those cravings in your body, your mind having to wrestle with, yes, that taste, would be very soothing. Why would sexual lust is always there? Besides the fact, remember, we're in the world that we're constantly exposed to it. Right? You're constantly exposed to it. So again, I think you might see my point here is when he says that God gave them over. Now, what is when Paul says God gave them over, gave them up to uncleanness? Why? At some point in their mind, they refuse to change. They refuse the truth. And so when he said, okay, well, God gives them up, now they're living as a slave to their lower nature, their bodies. But when we kind of go back, what's worse is this will, the mind and will that rejects God, that says, I'm rejecting you, God. That's what's worse. That, okay, I'm rejecting the truth. So now the church has gotten into a war, a culture war, let's say with the LGBT, whatever, right? Well, what's their problem? They need to come to Christ, just like I needed to come to Christ. And I think one of the worst things is that the church has made it a political war. That's why you never win them. You never win them. But we're going to go on because, again, I wanted to keep bringing this up here as far as understanding why, how sinful man operates, what God saved. Okay. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. Our comments so welcome, and I'll see you next Friday night.